Let's start with the first podcast. There's a whole set of basic concepts when you're looking at a class like this, because in many ways, it's fairly common to have something like this class, maybe at a graduate level, but it's really sort of uncommon to have this at the undergraduate level, simply because most faculty are more focused on one particular academic discipline. So they're not cross-trained, and they're generally not cross-trained in sort of multicultural backgrounds. Like I said at the intro of the class, this is actually sort of an unusual class. But I think that gives you some advantages in that you're getting what would oftentimes be the sort of synthetic treatments you would get in a graduate course at the undergraduate level. So one of the things that you have to do when you're looking at this is you have to remember you're going through both a lot of material, but you're also looking at it from different points of view. So it's not a consistent point of view. Sometimes we're looking at this from the standpoint of the way that geographers look at especially landscapes in place. Other times, especially when we're looking at material objects, we're looking at it from the standpoint of, say, an anthropologist or a sociologist. So we're bouncing back and forth. And of course, within this context, we're always looking at it from the idea of sort of interior design, or the functional aspects of place, space, and people. And this is where geography sort of is central to all this, since the study of geography basically is the study of people and the world around them, or if you would, people, place, and space. And then cultural geographers, which is what I am and what this class is, specifically are looking at the way that group, a culture, society, ethnicity, whatever, basically shape the way that we view the world around it. And if you would, bias it, prejudge it in such a ways that when we're looking at something, we're not looking at something from a rational, functional standpoint. It's always embedded within some set of concepts and values that we were brought up with or have sort of acquired or absorbed over time. So initially, that's why when this semester, the first couple of modules in this semester, especially the first module, we're actually looking at a lot of these sort of basic concepts that we use to basically both talk about the world around us and the way we view it, and also sort of discuss this idea of sort of filtering in the way that we view the world in a context that's shaped by our experiences. So the most central concept of all this is the concept of culture. A lot of the terms that we see in this semester, especially conceptual terms in geography, in some ways, geographers should come up with new versions of them because they're so commonly used by everyone that they sort of don't have meaning anymore. If you say the word culture, I'm not sure exactly what people would think that word means. I know what it means from the standpoint of an anthropologist geographer, and that's the version we're using here. So when we're talking about these terms this semester, I want you to be using the definitions of the conceptual basis that I'm giving you now. If you want to use culture in your private life, in some other context in terms of, the quality of music you listen to or the art that you consume, then that's fine. But that's not how we're looking at it. We're looking at it in this particular way. Now, there's several things that are key to the concept of culture. One is it's a group. Cultures are not individuals. Individuals can express aspects of culture, but individuals do not make culture. Culture is a collective thing. And this is what makes it very different than the way it's oftentimes used, especially in, say, a classroom when someone talks about a multicultural classroom. What they're actually talking about is individuals who come from diverse cultural backgrounds. But as individuals, they are not their culture. They're only reflecting part of it, or a piece of it, or certain aspects of it that are amplified. So the key aspects of culture is it's collective. And therefore, when you're talking to an individual or looking at a particular place or looking at a particular piece of furniture or whatever, it's within the context of being part of that. But it's definitely a situation where the whole is greater than the parts. The second part is culture is learned. You're not born Hawaiian. You're not born Celtic. You're not born Scottish. You're born into a big group, which might bring you up that way. But if your entire genetic background was Scottish, but you were born in France, you're going to end up, the culture you're going to absorb is going to be French, if that's the people around you and that's what you've grown up with. So, there's no such thing as sociobiological programming of culture, which is something that it drives folks like me crazy when someone says, well, this is my genetic heritage, so this is what I am in terms of what I've learned. And I'm like, yeah, good luck. So culture is something that's learned. You don't have any more affinity for something just because you were genetically programmed in it. And if that was the case, among other things, cultures would never change. If you think about it, because you're pre-programmed that way. Second, this culture is transmitted or communicated. And this is probably the part where anthropology has really fallen down, and then also psychology, sociology, the three sort of behavioral disciplines that completely failed in this. And that we do not really understand how cultures learn. If you've got, I've got, little grandnieces and grandnephews running all over the place, and they are very quickly acquiring a huge amount of the world around them at an incredibly young age. And I'm sure you're familiar with this. But if you actually were to track down where they got something, I get occasionally blamed for this for teaching them stuff. It's very hard to actually figure out where they got it because some stuff you tell them they don't remember. Other stuff you don't remember anyone telling them, but they definitely got it. And we all did this. The transmission of culture is incredibly complex and incredibly poorly understood. And how culture is communicated is also incredibly poorly understood. An example would be in the context here would be the use of hula. If someone performs hula, okay, that means that they've learned it. Someone transmitted the patterns and the movements and maybe some knowledge of what they're doing to them. But how that's being communicated, what the audience is picking up of that, is going to be incredibly variable. Just in a group of say 5 people who might all know hula that are going to get different things out of it. So you have to remember that culture is an incredibly complicated thing. And a classic example is to use your own backgrounds. If you think about it, would be how you learn your language. If you think about it, you know stuff. And if you've got, again, younger relatives, they are learning language, oftentimes maybe words or things they're not supposed to know. But if you actually track down how they learned it, what they choose not to learn, what you've forgotten, what you never remembered, you're not going to find that there's any coherent pattern to it that you can actually go and look at a book and it'll say, this is how people learn a language. If like me, you're constantly trying to sort of re-up your Chinese or Maraculi Mandarin, Putonghua or Japanese, you learn a language, you can buy bilingual or multilingual, but how you use it and what you remember of it and stuff is one thing. But even more important is if someone asks you, well, how'd you learn French? I don't know. I mean, I know who I think I learned it from, but what I learned and what I didn't learn, I don't remember. So if someone says, well, can you teach someone a language? You can go, yeah, but what you're really saying is, yeah, I could try. So culture is transmitted and communicated. So people learn culture. People can learn other cultures. This is what we call acculturation or assimilation. And because of this, and because it's collective, culture is a constantly fascinating concept in the fact that it's both conservative, because you're always going to teach people based on what you learned, which of course is in the past by definition. And in most societies, this is generally taught by elders. It's one reason why in many societies you have old people take care of the kids. Among other things, they're not only taking care of the little munchkins, but what they're actually doing is they're teaching them the culture based on their past that might be 30, 50, 70 years, from ago. And so culture is invariably going to be based in what was. And you can see this in the constant discussion going on in the United States, which I might call it culture wars. On the other hand, because we live in a constantly changing world, and we always have, all societies are changing. All societies have always changed in the past. They never were fixed in a particular spot. They were always modifying and dynamically changing themselves. And so it's mean that culture always has a tension. And you see this, if you remember when you were growing up, there would be what the old folks told you and what you were supposed to do. And then there was what you did and what you thought made sense versus the old stuff that didn't make sense anymore that the old folks were trying to tell you. This is the constant sort of, tension in culture, is the fact that on one hand, it's conservative by nature. On the other hand, it's constantly having to change to deal with the changes internally and externally in the world around us. And so culture is a constantly moving target. So this is why if someone says, well, I'm grounded in my culture and I know my culture, the first thing you should be thinking is, well, one, what does that mean? And two, what part of the culture are they talking about? Because they're not talking one about the whole thing. And they're also talking about some selected point in both time and place in terms of what it is they're talking about. And this is why people you can have 4 or 5 people, all parts, well read and well understood and well versed in their own culture, cannot agree on a lot of stuff. And none of them are wrong. They're just looking at different parts of and interpreting different parts of their past and their present. So culture is an incredibly complicated term. That's why there's some movement in anthropologists just not use the word anymore, because you just really can't figure out what the hell you're talking about, what it means. But it's still in common use, and there's really no alternative to it. The two subterms that are in some ways more useful, but also equally tricky, would be the concept of society and ethnicity. Society is a real easy one. Society is basically a subset of culture. If you're talking about the members of a culture that are in a particular place at a particular point in time, and especially if they came from the same region or same area, then that would be a society. So a society is geographic. It's a place-specific subset of a larger culture. So, for example, the Chinese who came over in the 19th century to settle in Hawaii or to settle in California and say San Francisco's Chinatown, that would be part of the society of Chinese Americans that are from that particular point in time in that particular place. Now, Chinese that have moved over there, say in the 1990s, 2000s period, are also part of the same culture. And in many, they're all from Guangdong region, so they speak the same dialect of Chinese, but they come with basically 100+ years of difference experience because the Chinese from China recently didn't have the yellow peril, didn't have all the things that Chinese here put up with, but the Chinese here didn't put up with all the revolutions and the wars and the civil wars, et cetera, and the People's Republic and all the stuff that happened post 1880. So on one hand, they share some values, for example, with Chinese New Year's, and maybe how they do a wedding. On the other hand, they're going to be radically different in terms of how they see some other stuff. So when you're talking about society, you're talking about a group in a particular place, and they generally have a history or heritage that comes from a particular time and place also in the past. So society is a subset of culture. It's a hugely useful term in most places because otherwise you have the tendency of people to say, for example, Japanese, or they'll say Chinese, or they'll say Italian, would be a good example. Well, yeah, they can have a lot of shared similarities because they share the same cultural base, but their historical divergence might be pretty radical. And so you can make a lot of sort of embarrassing mistakes if you assume commonality when there isn't that much necessarily. Ethnicity is an entirely different term. Ethnicity is a real tricky term. It's incredibly popular right now. We use it a lot here in Hawaii, and it's almost probably one of the most abused or misused terms that I know of. Ethnicity actually has two requirements. The first requirement is the individual identifies themselves as being part of that group. Second is that group has to accept the individual's argument or the individual's identity. So ethnicity is not who you think you are. Ethnicity is a combination of who you think you are and the group that identifies with that accepts you as a member of the group. In my own family, some of the members don't want to be Native American, never did. And so they just basically said, we're not. They define themselves as either Mexican or just didn't. So they didn't accept their ethnic background. Now, ironically, if they had gone back to the reservation, even I can still get a reservation card. My niece has one. So the group would accept us. But because members of the family didn't accept being that ethnicity, they are not it. On the other hand, someone who had no Native American background, but sort of feels like they really feel like they should be Lakota, they can go around and talk all they want about it. But if the group doesn't see that they're a part of the group and doesn't buy into it, then they're also not part of that ethnic group. So ethnicity requires two parts to it. And you see here in Hawaii, it gets very complicated because people are in many cases truly multi-ethnic. They identify with multiple identifications of self, and multiple groups accept them as members of those groups. But for much of especially in the United States, ethnicity is a very strange concept because people either don't self-identify with it, or the group doesn't. This becomes a huge issue from, usually once every couple of months, there'll be someone who says, well, I was this or I was that. And then the group that identifies basically says, no, you're not. So it's a real common thing in the mainland. Or, for example, if you go to our sister school in Ohio, in Dayton, Dayton, Ohio was settled by largely Scandinavian and Germans. So theoretically, a lot of folks, if they're multi-generational there, come from that background. And but if they don't have any sense of being Scandinavian or German in their heritage, then they're not going to identify with ethnicity. And to be honest, I'm not really sure if in Dayton if there's actual groups that sort of make a noise about that ethnicity. In contrast to being sort of Anglo-American. And one of the other issues, you see it less here, but you do on the mainland, is the level of ethnic identity. Is Anglo-American an ethnicity? Is inner city La Raza populations an ethnicity? I would say no. They're part of groups, but you can have groups that aren't ethnic, and you can have groups that pretend they're ethnic but really aren't. Sons of Samoa would be a good example. They use discussions that sound like they're ethnic, but in reality, they're just inner city gangs. So ethnicity is a really tricky concept. Use the definition here. I don't care what you use outside of class, but for our purposes, ethnicity is this very specific set of concepts.